Good morning in the UK and good evening in Australia. Welcome from the Australian UK Chamber of Commerce. This is the second of a four-part series on the FTA. Today, we'll be discussing the benefits of the FTA on government procurement. General principle for governments to procure outside their domestic markets is that opening up to foreign markets creates greater efficiency in pricing and more opportunities for suppliers in foreign markets. An agreement of government procurement already exists under the WTO framework, and the FTA between Australia and the UK goes beyond the WTO government procurement agreement. To discuss the differences and how the procurement under the FTA builds on the WTO procurement agreements and the opportunities that lie ahead for both countries are the two leads on the recent FTA procurement. They are Juliana Reid and Alan McGuinness. Juliana is the co-head of Government Procurement Trade Policy at the Department of International Trade, and she's acted as lead government procurement negotiator in the UK-Australia and UK-Japan FTAs. Prior to negotiating procurement FTA chapters, Juliana supported the UK's accession to the WTO agreement on government procurement, ensuring UK businesses maintained legally guaranteed access to the 1.3 trillion worth of procurement opportunities post-EU exit. In addition, Juliana's worked on several other issues across government, including EU exit strategy and small business strategy. And our second speaker today is Alan McGuinness. Welcome, Alan. He's the Assistant Director, Goods and Government Procurement for the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Alan was the lead government procurement negotiator for the Australia-UK FTA and is leading government procurement negotiations with a range of other partners, including the EU and India. Alan is also Australia's current representative to the WTO agreement on government procurement and its committee. Welcome, Juliana and Alan, and over to you, Juliana.
Hi, Joe. Thank you for that introduction. It's nice to hopefully see you all and get some questions later. As Joe mentioned, I was the chapter lead on the UK side for the UK-Australia procurement chapter. Alan is also on the call. We'll be doing a brief introduction into government procurement and taking some of your questions afterwards. So if there's anything you've ever wanted to know about government procurement and how it's covered in trade deals, now is your time to ask. So I will just run you through the contents. So we'll be covering what is government procurement, why it's important, the WTO GPA, which Joe has mentioned that both Alan and I have worked on before, the UK-Australia procurement rules specifically, and the market access commitments in the FTA chapter, how you can benefit, and also what you should do if you experience a barrier to a procurement which you believe is covered by this trade agreement. So first things first, what is procurement? Starting completely from the basics. So it's anything and everything the government and public bodies purchase. So not sector specific, it can cut across many different areas. So things like building schools or even supplying catering services to a prison. And why is it important? Well, on average, about 13% of GDP is spent on government procurement in OECD countries. So that's a huge amount of money that's going into procurement. But different countries have different rules on who can access these contracts and how they're governed. So procurement chapters and FTAs aim to level this playing field and ensure that businesses can access procurements and tap into that huge amount of GDP that's being spent on procurement all over the globe. So how is this covered in FTAs? The main aim of procurement chapters in FTAs is to ensure that procurement systems are open, they're transparent and accessible on a non-discriminatory basis. So this would mean that UK and Australian businesses have the same right to access government procurement in each other's markets as a local business were. So for example, if an Australian business were to bid for a government contract in the UK, which is covered by the UK-Australia agreement, it can be sure that it won't be discriminated against in favour of a UK supplier. So we wouldn't say, oh, actually, we want to give this contract to a UK supplier to support the local industry. We would treat Australian and UK suppliers in exactly the same way. So what we really try and do in a procurement chapter is ensure that the rules which countries apply to procurement are a high standard, and also ensure that these rules apply to as many different types of procurement as possible. So that quite neatly splits up into how procurement commitments are structured in an FTA. And hopefully this will be helpful for you if you ever want to look at what types of procurement are covered by an FTA, to see where you can be sure that you will not be discriminated against if you bid for those procurements. So there are two parts of a procurement chapter in an FTA. There is the text of the agreement and also the coverage schedules. So the text of the agreement establishes a set of rules to ensure that procurement is done in a particular way, so following particular principles. And if parties deviate from these rules, they face disciplinary action from other parties. So some of the core rules that you'll be most interested in, the very, very main one is the principle of national treatment and non-discrimination. So that this means that foreign suppliers will receive exactly the same treatment as domestic ones. There are also a large amount of provisions on the procurement process. So, for example, the length of time that a procurement should be advertised for, and how long after the procurement has been run should suppliers be told about the outcome, as well as many other things. And also importantly, most procurement chapters, including the procurement chapter between the UK and Australia, include provisions on domestic review. So what this means is that if you think the agreement has been breached, you can challenge it. So if you bid for a procurement and you feel you've been discriminated against, or the agreement has been breached in some way, for example, the procurement has not been advertised for as long as it should have been, according to the agreement, then you are able to either ask for some form of compensation or potentially ask for procurement to be rerun. So there are provisions in place so that if you feel that you have not been treated in accordance with the agreement, you are able to challenge that. The second part of a procurement chapter is the coverage schedules. And this outlines the market access that is covered by the agreement, and therefore the types of procurement that is subject to the rules and the terms of the agreement. And it's worth noting that only types of procurement that are covered by in these schedules, in these annexes, is subject to the rules in the main text of the agreement. So what will be included is a list of bodies and activities covered by the agreement, which we can go into in a little bit more detail now. So when you think of what is in a procurement chapter, you kind of almost have to think on a kind of matrix system. So on one axis, you've got the fact that there's the types of entities that are covered. So you've got 3 different annexes. So you've got central government entities, sub-central. So for Australia, that might mean state and territory level. For the UK, that could mean local governments. And then you have what is sort of broadly termed other entities. And that really varies by country. Different countries structure their entities in different ways. For the UK, that broadly means utility companies, utility entities that are in the public domain, whereas for Australia, that might mean more federal level entities. However, what you've also got to think, not just is the department that is procuring, is that covered, but also is the thing that they are procuring covered? So the goods and the services, for example. Goods generally in most procurement chapters, certainly in the GPA and the UK-Australia FTA, tend to be covered unless they are defence related. So generally speaking, a good will be covered. There are exemptions and different rules apply when it relates to defence procurement. And the UK and Australia apply those exemptions slightly differently. But broadly speaking, if it's anything related to defence, it won't be covered. But if it is any other good, then it should be covered, you'd expect. Services as well. Is the service that the department is procuring covered? And we'll get onto in a moment how that might differ across the UK and Australia. Finally, if it's construction services, slightly different rules apply. So you would have to look in the relevant annex to see what applies. And again, we'll touch on that later. Finally, in the final annex, Annex 7, you would have the general notes, and that's a place for parties to list out any other exemptions they might have. So the UK, for example, often takes exemptions to state that procurement for broadcasting content is not covered. And to our UK stakeholders on the line, you'll understand very well that that's kind of protection for the BBC to ensure that the BBC can procure the kind of broadcasting material that it wants to without having to be subject to the requirements of this agreement. The other thing to bear in mind is not just is the entity covered and is the type of procurement covered, but also is the procurement above a certain threshold. So this threshold can vary slightly depending on the type of procurement, and it's all if you were to ever feel you wanted to have a look at the market access annexes, which perhaps you don't, I wouldn't blame you, they're quite technical. You will see that across the different annexes, they're slightly different. So they range from the numbers that are displayed on the screen, which I won't run through and bore you, but what we hope you will see is actually that those thresholds are relatively low. And given the distance between our respective countries and the logistical challenges that the distance can bring, we imagine that you'd kind of only really be interested in contracts above that value anyway. So hopefully that suggests to you that contracts above the value, the ones that you're interested in, and the thresholds are not something you need to be too concerned with. So everything above the threshold is covered, provided it's elsewhere in the market access schedules, unless there are specific exemptions, for example, around defence, as I mentioned. So what we can start to think about now is how does all this apply to the UK and Australia respectively, and what actually existed before this FTA. So both the UK and Australia are members of the WTO Government Procurement Agreement, which was mentioned earlier. The UK has been a member for a considerable amount of time, previously through the EU. Now we are independent members, and Australia joined a few years ago. The WTO GPA is a plurilateral agreement between 21 parties, or 48 WTO members if you break up the EU. And the combined total of opportunities within this agreement is estimated to be £1.3 trillion or 2.5 trillion Australian dollars. So you can see that there's a huge amount of opportunities within this agreement. And there are some major world economies within this agreement. For example, the US, the EU, Japan, Canada, as well as obviously the UK and Australia. So there's a huge amount of opportunities within that. And that already applied to the UK and Australia. But what we've done within our FTA is really build on that. So I'll run through some of the main elements of the GPA, just so you can understand the basis on which this FTA builds. So again, the main one, as I mentioned before, is national treatment and non-discrimination. So suppliers from, let's say, one party will not be discriminated against if they bid for a covered contract in another party. In another party's territory. There are also provisions on the procurement process to make sure it's transparent and there's open competition. And again, there is a domestic review clause, so you can challenge if you think that the agreement has been breached. And this can lead to compensation or procurement being rerun. But remember, this only applies to procurement which is covered by the agreement. So if a party or a country has decided not to cover a certain type of procurement, these rules will not apply. So I'm sure, as you can imagine, when a country decides to join the GPA, there are a huge amount of negotiations because countries want them to cover as much procurement as possible, but they obviously want to give a competitive offer. And potentially some countries want to retain space for domestic policy reform and want to retain space to be able to award certain contracts to local suppliers, depending on the policy of that country. But broadly speaking, it's worth saying that the UK and Australia already have pretty open procurement systems. So, for example, the UK government's policy is not to discriminate against foreign suppliers anyway, but instead to focus on value for money. So we would always look at the tender, the bid which has the lowest cost, rather than focusing on where the bid has come from. So particularly for procurements being run in the UK, the main benefit of the GPA and also of the UK-Australia procurement chapter is the legal certainty that it provides and the fact that suppliers can challenge the outcome of a contract award. So even if procurements, UK procurements aren't covered by the GPA, chances are you're not going to be discriminated against if you bid for it, but you will not have the legal certainty that you absolutely won't be discriminated against. And if you feel that you have been, there are not those kind of international legal remedies that you have at your disposal. So the main point of the GPA is that it provides that real legal certainty. Alan, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you, Juliana, and thanks for all of the information you've helpfully run through thus far. I just really wanted to echo what you've been talking to on this slide. Obviously, Australia was very pleased to complete its accession to the GPA in 2019, so just under 3 years ago. And it was for the reasons you've outlined, all of those mutual benefits and access to all the collective procurement opportunities. And like the UK, Australia, as the default setting, already has an open procurement system, very much like the UK, looking to the principles of value for money, non-discrimination and competition. But I couldn't agree with you more that it's absolutely in getting that guaranteed sort of treaty level, legally bound access under the GPA and our bilateral FTA that makes it so worthwhile. Thanks, Juliana.
Thanks, Alan. So those are the sort of chapter commitments that apply in the GPA. And now we can take a bit of a look at the market access, which the UK and Australia offer under the GPA. So the UK to Australia offers comprehensive central government access. So those are the main government departments, like my department, for example, the Department for International Trade. There'll be things like schools, universities, hospitals, police forces, a wide range of sort of central government access. To Australia, we do not offer any local government procurement. We do offer it to other GPA parties, but most GPA parties tend to make sure their offer reflects what the other party offers in return. And we'll speak in a moment about what Australia offers. And we offer some services in the GPA. However, we don't offer quite as many as, for example, Australia offers to other parties. So while we have a very comprehensive offer in terms of the government departments that would be covered, the services are perhaps more limited. And we do not cover what are called works concessions for Australia. So works concessions are a sort of type of public-private partnership whereby you might have something like a department decides that it wants let's say the Department for Transport wants a road to be built, but they say, okay, we'll give you the contract for the road, but in the meantime, we'll say you're able to exploit the contract for a period of 10 years by building a toll bridge, a tolling station on the road. So you are able to take all the profits from drivers going past that road, but that means that you assume the risk. So if there are no drivers and you therefore don't get any profit, that's your problem, basically. It's not the government's problem. So that type of contract, which is generally used for very large infrastructure construction projects, is not something that we cover for Australia. Looking now at the Australian offer, Alan, would you like to run through this?
Yes, absolutely. So thanks, Juliana. So under the GPA, on our accession to the agreement in 2019, we pulled together a very up-to-date and comprehensive market access offer for the GPA parties, including the UK. So we cover all of our main federal or Commonwealth government entities of the Australian government, as well as the primary agencies and departments of our state and territory governments at the subcentral government level. So, very similar. It's key government departments and agencies that are subject to each government's procurement framework and procurement rules. And in Australia, each state and territory and then the federal government have their own jurisdiction, their own control over those procurement frameworks. So each state and territory had to agree to be part of our GPA offer and came to be part of our comprehensive package. We don't cover what in the Australian context we call local governments. So that's the level below our state governments, and it's really the local government areas, so sort of councils and things like that. And that really is a factor of the fact that they don't do much procurement that would fall above the procurement thresholds in the GPA, those that Juliana spoke to earlier. It's not what we believe is commercially meaningful opportunities in the main for the GPA partners, and it's very consistent across our trade agreements and including the GPA that we don't offer that coverage. As Juliana mentioned, we have a very broad services offer in the GPA because we have what's called a negative list, which means we cover everything unless it's on a very short list of services that we specifically don't cover, and a lot of them relate to blood and plasma products, some sort of medical specific services. And what we do cover as a default, although subject to negotiation, is what we call build, operate, transfer, or public works concession contracts. So very similar to what Juliana mentioned at the end of her list there, those types of public-private partnerships. Thanks, Juliana. Back to you.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, having established that baseline of opportunities and of rules that apply between the UK and Australia under the WTO GPA, how does the UK-Australia FTA build on this? And there are a few different ways that we do. So we have improved non-discrimination provisions. So we've really tried to strengthen those provisions that mean that suppliers are not discriminated against based on where they come from. So, for example, we've clarified some areas of ambiguity in the GPA around pre-procurement engagement. So we said that any market research that is done before a procurement is run, any consultations with suppliers that are done must be done in a way that is non-discriminatory. We've also really beefed up the electronic procurement requirements. So the GPA was negotiated back in 2012, and there's a number of different members, some of whom have differing levels of electronic procurement. The UK and Australia have very high standards when it comes to electronic procurement. So we have a requirement that all procurement must be conducted electronically. So they must be advertised, procurements must be advertised in portals online. So it's not a case that you go to your local department and get a piece of paper and then you can bid for a procurement based on that, but suppliers overseas don't have access to that piece of paper. It's very much all of the opportunities are online, so suppliers all over the globe and suppliers in our respective countries can access them. Tenders must be, or bids must be accepted electronically, unless in exceptional circumstances, for example, if you had to submit a model for some sort of architectural procurement, and supplier registration systems must be available electronically. So if there's a system whereby you need to register to become a supplier, that registration must be something that is available to do electronically. We also have improved anti-corruption text. So we have put in place, we have text which puts in place measures, encourages the UK and Australia to put in place measures to eliminate corruption in the procurement process. This is something that's very important to both of our countries, and also is something that sets a very high standard also in future FTAs going forward. Having such an ambitious anti-corruption provision suggests to all our future trading partners for both the UK and Australia that corruption in procurement is something that we just absolutely want to eliminate as much as is absolutely possible. We also have some provisions around sustainability in procurement. So again, this clarifies the slight ambiguity in the GPA to suggest that contracting authorities can consider environmental, social, and labour impacts of a procurement when selecting a supplier, provided that this is done in a non-discriminatory way. And that's absolutely key. This is not a backdoor for any kind of discrimination. It's just about ensuring that, given the times we live in, that these considerations can be taken into account if they are non-discriminatory. And finally, we have GPA plus text, so text that goes above the GPA with regards to facilitating SME participation. So we have an article about how we are going to help SMEs get into our respective procurement markets. So, for example, tender documents must be free, procuring entities must provide prompt payment when it comes to procurements. In terms of the additional market access, so we've established the baseline of market access that exists between the UK and Australia and the GPA. How does the UK FTA build on that? So, for example, we offer some additional so we don't offer any local government coverage to Australia in the GPA, but we do offer some larger local governments to Australia in the FTA. We offer transport entities and some additional services. And finally, those works concessions, which I mentioned are not covered to Australia in the GPA, are covered in the FTA. And Alan, do you want to run through Australia's additional offer?
Absolutely. Thanks again, Juliana. So, in very similar vein, so what we did is we went away and consulted all of our state and territory governments and across the Australian government, and did our absolute best to bring forward additional entities at both of those levels. So going beyond what the UK already has guaranteed access to under the GPA. So, for example, at the Australian government level, our offer under the FTA includes all of Australia, the Australian government's top 10 procuring entities for the two most recent financial years, for example, which alone accounted for 84% by value of the Australian government's total procurement contracts, and included the addition of the Australian Digital Health Agency, which became a top 10 entity in the 2019-20 financial year. We also, as I said, added state and territory entities, including adding additional transport and infrastructure functions for several of our largest states, such as New South Wales and Victoria. And we agreed to carve back in, for want of a better word, to cover that wide range of services that we're able to cover and weren't previously covering for the UK, except for that very short list that Australia has as a so-called negative list, just around 5 categories that apply to others. So the UK now has access at both the national and state and territory level to the full range of Australia's possible services coverage. Thanks, Juliana.
Thanks, Alan. And one other thing that it's worth mentioning is in the new FTA, is a commitment to negotiate local government market access if Australia ever offers it to another FTA. So you might have seen this referred to in the press as the sort of local government side letter that sits alongside the FTA procurement chapter. So what we'll hope that you see here is that technically, not every single type of procurement is covered for either the UK or Australia in this agreement, but a very large percentage, the majority of meaty procurements are now covered between the UK and Australia, whether under the GPA or this new revised agreement. So there's a huge amount of opportunities on offer for both UK and Australian businesses. So you might be asking yourself, how can you access these opportunities? I'm sure many of you will be aware already that there are portals online. So the UK has a find a tender service, which we launched post EU exit, as obviously we did not have access to the EU system anymore. Australia has AusTender, and there are also state and territory level portals for state and territory specific procurement. To see information about upcoming procurements, we suggest looking at departmental pipeline documents. So for the UK government, if you type in sort of any major government department, let me put the lights back on. If you look at any major government department website, so for example, you would type in DI, Department for International Trade, procurement pipeline, you will get a list of all the sort of upcoming procurement opportunities for the next year or so. There are other resources as well. So, Alan, I don't know if a moment you want to talk to the infrastructure pipeline. The UK also has a national infrastructure outlook and pipeline. We can make sure these slides are sent to you afterwards so you can access all the links within them and see all the opportunities available on offer. Alan, did you want to come in?
Only very briefly, I think you've covered that very well. So like the UK's Find a Tender, our AusTender and state and territory level e-tendering portals are the best one-stop shop point to go to, and often also they include that forward procurement pipeline Juliana was alluding to, directly or through easy to find cross links, and that includes the upcoming and planned procurements foreshadowed, as well as the current tenders open right now. And the only other thing I was going to add is that we, as does the UK, publish links on the WTO GPAs. It's called the eGPA portal. I think one of these links actually goes there on the slide, which has all of those individual government portals, collated into a single page. Thanks, Juliana.
Great, thank you. So on the next slide, we have a few sort of high-level information about opportunities coming up. that you might be interested in. So one in the UK, which all I'm sure our UK businesses will be very aware of, is High Speed 2, otherwise known as HS2, which is a massive, very, very long railway that is being built in the UK between London and the north, which has many contracts, whether they are construction, project management, many services contracts as well, many of which are multi-million-pound, so may be of interest to you. As well as that, there's also many, of course, central government opportunities, particularly around procurement of services, which I'm sure will be of interest to you, because getting goods across the globe can sometimes be challenging given the distance between our countries, whereas some of those services, I imagine, are things that you are able to provide remotely, so could get around some of the logistical difficulties of getting things between our two countries. Alan, did you want to run through Australia opportunities?
Absolutely, thanks, Juliana. So, along a similar vein of, obviously we don't have the High Speed 2, but an excellent opportunity there. We have on the AusTender portal, these can all be found, but a wide range of Australian government departments, such as Services Australia, which is going to be looking for financial intelligence and investigation software services. Our Department of Home Affairs, a very large portfolio, has mail and cargo transport opportunities, and also capital works and construction, industrial construction panel opportunities. And our digital transformation agency has a data center panel, and we'll be coming to establish a new panel arrangement for data services, just for example, but those are just some large agency procurements. Then at the state and territory level, a similar story. So each state and territory has its forward pipeline. Queensland has a range of information and communications technology opportunities in the pipeline across the state, estimated at between the 1 and 5 million Australian dollar mark for ICT infrastructure refreshes, online newsletter services, as well as ICT testing services, for example. New South Wales has a managed service provider tender looking for whole of government services, for example, around payment and contingent labour and statements of work, as well as a food service. Juliana mentioned food catering earlier, food services across the New South Wales Health Network, but the actual goods themselves, so the sort of various products for distribution to hospitals. And finally, the Northern Territory has supply and delivery of pharmaceutical products and compounding services, over $126 million there, and energy-related financial engineering and technical advice consultancy services, a 2-year panel contract that's looking at around 3 million Australian dollars. So as you can see, a wide swathe there, all available on the online portals. Thank you, Juliana.
Thank you, Alan. So finally, what we're going to be looking at is, if you bid for any of these procurements that you believe are covered by the agreement and you feel you've been discriminated against or the agreement has been breached in some way, what can you do? So for UK businesses, there is a link here where you can report the barrier. So this will take you to an online portal. But equally, if you want to contact us, we're very happy to hear from you and see, the UK and Australia. Myself and Alan will continue to have kind of ongoing dialogues. And we have a provision in the agreement about cooperation, so we'll continue to have ongoing dialogues, and we'd be happy to hear, in fact, very keen to hear about your barriers and to discuss together how we can try and ensure those come down in the future. So both Yasmin and I have our email addresses on the screen there, so if you want to get in touch with us, always very happy to hear from you. Alan, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Juliana. Yes, absolutely in the same vein. So the Australian government, the link is there. We have our Trade Barriers Register, which is a place that Australian exporters, including to the UK, can register any concerns or issues they're facing, that aren't related to tariffs and non-tariff barriers, including, of course, in this instance, related to government procurement and our agreements. And also on the slide is my team's inbox, which again, we're always happy to hear about concerns. As Juliana said, we'll be in ongoing dialogue, and we have a range of cooperation areas that have been flagged in the agreement. And we're also very keen to hear about success stories. So if there are any fantastic opportunities that businesses have been successful in tendering for, we're always keen to hear about that as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, actually, off the back of that, I might also say this is, obviously this presentation is specific to UK, Australia, but if there are any other barriers you face, please use this tool. If there's, we have FTAs upcoming with many different countries, Mexico, Israel, Gulf Cooperation Council, India. I'm sure you've seen them on the press. So if you have any barriers in those countries as well, let us know, and we can see if we can try and do something about them before before they even start, and during them as well. So yes, that takes us to the end of the presentation. Joe, I will pass over to you. I know you were going to handle a Q&A.
Thank you, Juliana, and thank you, Alan, for a really excellent session. And I was pleased to hear that there's some benefits for SMEs. Prompt payments is always a good one, and also free tenders. So that's excellent to hear. We've got some good questions coming up, so I'll hand it over to both of you. Just a one at the beginning, the layman's difference between the GPA and the FTA.
Yeah, I would say you probably don't massively need to focus on the difference. As sort of Alan and I both said, if you think you're interested in procurement, just bid for it. Don't try and only bid for things that are covered by the GPA and the FTA, because broadly speaking, we do have very open procurement systems anyway. The layman's difference is probably that the FTA is slightly more ambitious, and the rules that apply to procurements under the FTA is more ambitious. But actually, in terms of the practice that you experience when you're bidding for procurement, there will be no difference. So this kind of background that we gave, the technical stuff, in case you're interested, but if you're not, you don't really need to think about it. You only really need to think about it if you feel you've been discriminated against in some way and you want to do something about it. Then you need to see which agreement would apply. Alan, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
No, I think you've covered that really well, Juliana. I agree. I mean, yeah, obviously other than the difference with the WTO GPA having all the other parties as opposed to the FTA just being between the UK and Australia, and as you said, the sort of disciplines and the ideas in the GPA are very much reflected in our bilateral FTA, and we just built on those in those areas you outlined in the presentation, including to add some clarity and spell out some things the GPA may have been a bit more vague or silent about. But yeah, I think functionally no difference in terms of bidding in either of our markets. It's those protections that the agreements offer.
Excellent. Are you able to confirm the relevance of the threshold? What if below or what if above, and what does cover actually mean?
Sure. So the relevance of the threshold, well, maybe starting with what does covered mean? Covered means that the rules of the agreement apply. If the procurement is something that is in those market access schedules and is therefore so-called covered by the agreement, it means that the rules of the agreement do apply to that procurement. So you cannot be discriminated against for that procurement, or if you feel like you are and the agreement's been breached, you have access to some sort of resolution, whether that's procurement being rerun or compensation or whatever it may be. So for it to be covered, it has to be above a certain threshold. And the real relevance for that threshold is that you may find, whether in the UK or Australia or in other countries, that if the procurement is below threshold, that can be where sort of more local policies tend to emerge. So for very small procurements, you don't necessarily have to go through a formal process of advertising it for a certain amount of time, because quite frankly, it wouldn't really be worth it for the governments, and it wouldn't necessarily be worth it for businesses either. If we've got a procurement for, let's say we need to buy £10,000 worth of desks, is there that much point in going through a very rigorous procurement process where it has to be advertised for a certain amount of time, like the amount of bureaucracy that would create? So it's really for the bigger procurements, and we'll send around those slides which outline the thresholds in each of our domestic regulations. So it's for the bigger procurements where above those thresholds, which would be covered by the agreement and where those rules of the agreement would apply. Hopefully that answers the question.
We have a comment here, a really interesting session, so that's very good feedback. If an Australian or UK company wants to bid for tenders but doesn't want to set up in the market they're bidding in, will procurement providers be able to reject bids if companies aren't setting up in that country? or will that be considered discrimination under the rules?
Sure. I mean, I can answer this from a UK perspective and then maybe hand over to Alan from Australian perspective. But certainly from a UK perspective, there is no obligation to set up in the country. There may be for things that aren't covered by the agreement. For example, we do not cover healthcare procurement within the agreement because, again, I'm sure the UK businesses will be aware very much of the sensitivities around healthcare in the UK. So for things like healthcare procurement, healthcare service procurement, you may have to set up locally, but that's not covered by the agreement anyway. But for things covered by the agreement from a UK perspective, there would be absolutely no obligation to set up in the UK. I can pass over to Alan on the Australian side.
Thanks, Juliana. So a very similar picture on the Australian side. So for procurements that are covered by the rules of our agreements and are above the thresholds, which we just touched on in the last question, we absolutely don't have that requirement. We don't discriminate in our procurement based on the location or the ownership of the supplier. But as Juliana said, that absolutely applies to the covered areas of procurement and above those monetary thresholds. Which, as Juliana said, are set, and certainly in Australia's case, at a consistent level across our free trade agreements to give that, dependency and certainty to suppliers.
Another question, reminding what's the online tender portal called? I mean, Juliana, the slides will be available. Perhaps if people contact, because your contact details are on the slide, but if they contact us first at hello@australiachamber.co.uk, we'll pass on any queries, etc., to Juliana or Alan and the slides as well. So that's hello@australiachamber.co.uk. Another question on the threshold, what's the difference between 138k and 427k ends?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we ran through earlier, there's different types of entities, or different types of government departments or agencies that procure. So the lower threshold of 138 is for central government entities like the Department for International Trade, the Cabinet Office, the Home Office, sort of big government departments. The thresholds tend to get slightly higher, so more towards that 400,000 mark for things like our utility entities, where the thresholds are slightly higher. So it essentially means that depending on the government department that is purchasing, the thresholds might vary slightly. I would say, again, don't concern yourself about it too much because really you shouldn't be discriminated against anyway. But if you are interested to see how they match up, you can either have a look at the agreement or perhaps we can send something in writing afterwards about how across the different annexes or the different types of government entities those thresholds apply. But alternatively, if you want to see a list of the government entities that is covered, and at the very top of that list, it will show you the threshold. If you Google UK Australia procurement chapter or UK Australia FTA, you can go to the procurement chapter and have a look. It is very much just lists of entities with a number at the top telling you the threshold. So you might not want that detail, but if you're interested, it is there on the internet.
Thank you, Juliana. You may have covered this, but perhaps it's worth asking again. Should businesses only bid for those contracts which are covered by the agreement?
Short answer, and I'll hand over to Alan as well in a moment, is no. We'd really encourage you to bid for as many opportunities as possible. A large part of these contracts will be covered by the agreement anyway, because we've tried to make it as comprehensive and broad-ranging, wide-ranging as possible. But like I said, particularly, saying to Australian businesses, the UK market is very open. We seek value for money, so please do bid. We want to see as many options as possible. And I'm sure the message to the UK businesses is the same. Please bid for opportunities in Australia. If you experience any barriers, let us know. We'll see if we can help you in any way, whether for that particular procurement or for future procurements, if it's not something that we're able to address immediately. But I'll pass to Alan as well.
No, I think you've absolutely captured it, Juliana. Exactly the same in reverse. So as we've both already touched on, our market's already open and based on that value for money and competition principle, So I would say definitely bid for any contracts of interest. The tender documentation, of course, will have the specific requirements of the procurement and note any specialized requirements, etc. But no, yeah, I would say go for it. But as noted before, it really is just the difference between what we guarantee in a legal sense at the treaty level, and it doesn't mean that there are plenty of other opportunities out there. We very much welcome them, the suppliers to bid for them.
Just a question now on healthcare bids. Entity in Australia is required, but does this apply to digital healthcare bids?
I think this might have come from what I mentioned a moment ago about healthcare. So I can perhaps clarify a bit the position of the inclusion of healthcare in the UK-Australia FTA from a UK perspective. So something like the NHS, our National Health Service, is covered by the agreement for the procurement of goods. So any goods that are purchased, hospital beds, pharmaceuticals, whatever it may be, would be procured by the NHS, and there is no need to establish in the UK to bid for those contracts or to win those contracts even. Similarly, the services that are covered in the agreement are covered when procured by the NHS. So things like legal services, cleaning services, real estate services would all be covered, or information technology, digital services would be covered with no requirement to establish in the UK. Where the real sensitivity lies is the procurement of healthcare services. So if there's a branch of the NHS that is being run privately, or the government decides that part of it should be run privately, and they want to procure healthcare services, so they want to get a load of doctors on board, or they want radiology services, anything like that, that needs to be, that is not included within the agreement. I'm sure you can understand that there's sensitivities around healthcare, so that is why that is excluded from the agreement for both the UK and Australia as well. And it's a sensitivity across many, many different countries in the GPA as well. Very few countries would cover their healthcare services. Hopefully that answers the question.
Do the tender portals offer automatic nudges for certain sectors to avoid having to check daily and weekly?
That is a very good question. I am not entirely sure. I can go away and check that. I think they probably do have that capability. Yasmin is nodding at me, saying, yes, they definitely do have that capability, and I'll take Yasmin's word for it because she's a tech whiz. So yeah, I believe they do, but I couldn't say with 100% certainty, though it seems Yasmin is very sure. But yeah. Alan, I don't know on the Australian side if there's that capability.
No, off the top of my head, I would have to defer to my Australian Government Department of Finance colleagues who manage the AusTender portal. And of course, each state and territory manages theirs as well. It wouldn't surprise me if there's something along those lines, but I can't give a definitive. I know there's the ability to sign up for alerts and such with an email address, not through a rigorous process or anything. But yes, can't give a definitive on that specific question.
Thank you, Alan and Juliana. We've come to an end of questions. And I just want to now thank you both for covering a really comprehensive topic, which is the government procurement. I think both of you have stressed that, please participate, please apply. We are available here at the Australian UK Chamber of Commerce to also assist putting you in touch with the relevant parties. So please do get in touch. If you get in touch with us, hello@australiachamber.co.uk. This was the second of our 4-part series on the FTA, which combines the Australian and the UK government. So please stay tuned. I want to thank the audience for coming along and listening today. Thank you so much. Please do have a nice day if you're in the UK, and in Australia, a lovely evening. Thank you.